following the moral law of the Great Spirit written on his heart. He lives in greed and selfishness and rapacity. Now, I think we would all say that when judged by the standards of God's general revelation in nature and conscience, Walking Bear would find himself justly condemned before the bar of God's justice. But let's also suppose that if the missionaries had arrived with the gospel, that then Walking Bear would have believed the gospel and been saved. In that case, his damnation seems to hinge upon bad luck. He just had the bad luck to be born at a time and place in history before the missionaries arrived with the gospel. But surely it is unconscionable to think that an all-powerful and all-loving God would allow people to be eternally damned because of the accidents of history and geography. Secondly, even more fundamentally, why did God even create the world if he knew that so many people would not receive Christ freely and be lost? Why would he go to all the trouble of creating a world in which so many people would freely reject Christ and be forever damned? Thirdly, even more radically, why didn't God just create a world in which everybody freely places his faith in Christ and is saved? Such a world must be logically possible. It's logically possible for any person that person freely places faith in Christ and be saved. So why didn't God create a world in which everybody freely places his faith in Christ and is saved? Well, what is the Christian supposed to say in answer to these difficult questions? Does Christianity make God out to be cruel and unloving? Well, in order to answer these questions, I think we need to examine more closely the logical structure of the objection being posed by the religious pluralist. And if we might have our first overhead, please. Basically, what the objection is saying is that it's impossible for God to be all-powerful and all-loving, and yet some people never hear the gospel and are lost. That in some way these are contradictory with one another. God cannot be all-powerful and all-loving, and yet it be true that some people never hear the gospel and are lost. But why is this impossible? I mean, there's no explicit contradiction between A and B. One is not the negation of the other, so they're not explicitly contradictory. Now, if the religious pluralist is saying they are implicitly contradictory, then he must be assuming some hidden premises, some hidden assumptions which would bring out the contradiction and make it explicit. Then the question is, what are those hidden assumptions? Well, I must confess that in my reading of the literature of religious pluralism, I have never encountered any religious pluralist who successfully identifies what those hidden assumptions are that would bring out the alleged contradiction and make it explicit. But in the interest of argument, let's try to help out the religious pluralist here. Let's see if we can find what those hidden premises might be. It seems to me that they must be basically two. Number one is the assumption that if God is all-powerful, he can create a world in which everyone freely hears the gospel and is freely saved. If God is all-powerful, he could create a world in which everybody hears the gospel and is freely saved. And the second one is that if God is all-loving, he prefers a world in which everybody hears the gospel and is freely saved. Now, given that God is all-powerful and all-loving, as A stated, and that an all-powerful God could create a world in which everyone hears the gospel and is freely saved, and an all-loving God would prefer a world in which everyone hears the gospel and is freely saved, it follows that everyone should hear the gospel and be freely saved. But that contradicts B, which said that some people never hear the gospel and are lost. So it does seem to me that 1 and 2 represent the hidden assumptions made by the religious pluralist in claiming that there is some kind of a logical incompatibility between God's being all-powerful and all-loving and some people never hearing the gospel and being lost. So the question is, are these two assumptions necessarily true? Both of them must be necessarily true if A and B are to be logically incompatible. But are they? Well, let's think about them together. Let's take that first assumption, that if God is all-powerful, he can create a world in which everybody hears the gospel and is freely saved. Is that assumption necessarily true? Well, I think we could agree that an all-powerful God certainly could create a world in which everybody hears the gospel. That wouldn't seem to be beyond the bounds of omnipotence. But when you think about it, so long as people are free, there's no guarantee that in such a world, everybody would freely receive the gospel and believe in it and be freely saved. Being omnipotent or all-powerful does not mean the ability to make logically impossible states of affairs actual. Being omnipotent does not imply the ability to do the logically impossible. An almighty being does not have the ability to make a round triangle or a married bachelor. But to make someone freely do something is just as logically contradictory as making a round triangle or a married bachelor. If people are truly free, then there's no guarantee that they will all freely believe the gospel and be saved. In fact, when you think about it, there's really no reason at all to think that in a world in which everybody hears the gospel, that the balance between saved and lost in that world would be any better than the balance between saved and lost in the actual world. It's possible that in any world of free creatures, which God could create, that some people would freely reject him and his every effort to save them and be lost. And therefore, premise 1 is simply not necessarily true. It is not necessarily true that an all-powerful God can create a world in which everybody hears the gospel and is freely saved. And because premise 1 is not necessarily true, the argument offered by the religious pluralist is simply invalid. It is simply a fallacious argument. Well, that closes the case right there. But in the interest of discussion, let's press the analysis a notch further. Let's also look at assumption 2. Is assumption 2 necessarily true? It states that if God is all-loving, then he prefers a world in which everybody hears the gospel and is freely saved. Is that necessarily true? Well, let's suppose, contrary to what we said about premise 1, that there are possible worlds that God could create in which everybody hears the gospel and is freely saved. Does God's being all-loving compel him to prefer one of those worlds over the actual world? Well, not necessarily, I think. For these worlds in which there is universal salvation might have other overriding deficiencies which make them, on balance, less preferable. For example, suppose that the only worlds in which everybody would freely believe the gospel and be saved are worlds with only a handful of people in them, say 4 or 5. And that if God were to create any more people, then at least one of them would have rejected Christ and been lost. Does God's being all-loving compel him to prefer one of these radically underpopulated worlds over a world in which multitudes freely receive Christ and are saved, even though that means that some will freely reject God's every effort to save them and be lost? Well, that's certainly not obvious to me. It seems to me that so long as God gives sufficient grace for salvation to every human being that he creates, He's no less loving for preferring one of these more populous worlds, even though that means that some people might freely reject his love and his grace and be lost. So even though there could be worlds in which everybody freely believes in the gospel and is saved, that doesn't necessarily mean that God must prefer one of those worlds over the actual world, because those worlds might have other overriding deficiencies that on balance make them less preferable. So this second assumption made by the religious pluralist is also not necessarily true. And therefore the argument offered by the religious pluralist is doubly invalid. Neither of his critical assumptions